Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in today's one I'm showcasing this, my recent cheap and ugly gaming PC build. Now I didn't really intend to call it that, but when I built this PC over the weekend and showed one of my friends, that's exactly what he called it, so the name has sort of stuck. Now from the outside it doesn't look all that special, but on the inside it's a system comprised of components that should be able to handle all your esports games with ease. Things like Fortnight, do you mind? PUBG, and maybe even a AAA title here and there. So let's get into it, talk about the components I've used to build this thing, and see what it can do when it comes to gaming. So, I apologise for the lighting. Why do I look like a ghost? It's raining outside, I've had to boost the lights a little bit, so the contrast is a little bit off. But nonetheless, let's talk about the specs. So the case here is just the cheapest case I could find. I cannot remember the name of it. It will be probably up here somewhere or down here. But it's got everything you need to build a basic PC inside of. At the front we've got two USB 2 ports, which was essential because the motherboard I've used doesn't have any USB 3 connectors, and it's important when picking a case or a motherboard in fact that it matches the connectors on your front panel. You don't want a USB 3 case and a motherboard with no USB 3 connectors. There are adapters available, but it's easier if you choose the right case to begin with. Now for the motherboard, you've seen them before, I've used them before, but it's a good cheap Intel based board. This is the DQ67OW. It's a socket 1155 board and it supports pretty much every 1155 processor out there. This cost me about £15, £16, and I'm currently running a Core i5-2320, a 3 GHz quad-core CPU. That is among the cheapest older i5s you can currently buy. This cost me £12, and the heatsink fan here came with the motherboard, so I didn't have to worry about that. Now as I say, it is a basic i5 processor, but it still seems to do the job. It does an okay job of playing games. It's a pretty decent CPU for everyday usage, things like that, and you aren't going to see much slowdown even when it comes to multitasking. It's just a decent, cheap CPU that can be picked up for very little money in 2019. For the RAM, this cost me a little bit more. I've actually got 2 sticks of this stuff, but I can only get one out due to the graphics card. This is Team Elite 1600 MHz memory. We've got 8 gigs in total, 2 4 gig sticks of this stuff. It's pretty good RAM, pretty cheap stuff, and it works in this board just fine. In fact, a lot of people worry too much about whether RAM is going to be compatible with their motherboard, but I have to say that every time I've sort of been winging it, buying RAM and sticking it in a DDR3 board, I've had no compatibility issues. Of course, that's not brilliant advice, but always read the manual to see what is and isn't supported, just in case. Now for the piece de la resistance. I didn't take French at school. I took Spanish, but I don't remember a word of that either. We have the Asus Strix GTX 960. Now this cost me £65 at CEX here in the UK, and the thing with CEX is that you don't know exactly what you're going to get. All they do is list the basic specs of the card. For example, on the site this just said GTX 960, and so I thought, you know, I'll go and pick it up at my local store, and it turns out to be the Asus version. I could either have a 2 gig version or a totally different 4 gig version. It wasn't the Asus one, it was just a standard NVIDIA one, I believe. But nonetheless, the difference between the 960 in terms of VRAM is very minimal. In order to see a difference, you'd have to turn the settings right up to high or ultra, and even then there'd only be a few frames in it. Of course, in 2019, if you turn the settings right up on a GTX 960, you're not going to see playable frame rates anyway, so the difference between 24 and 26 FPS is going to be sort of irrelevant when playing games. Okay, what else? What else do we have? We've got a blue RGB fan in the back here. This case came with a standard black one, but I thought, you know, let's add a little bit of colour to this system, so I went with the blue one instead. Cost me about £3. I think it was a pretty wise investment. And in terms of storage, we've got a 240 gig SanDisk SSD. Now, when you're building a cheap PC, and when it comes to storage, My advice would be either buy the biggest SSD you can afford on your budget, because you're going to notice a lot of difference in boot up times, especially with an older processor. It's going to make a nice bit of difference as opposed to a standard hard drive. Or purchase a small SSD like a 64 gig SSD for the Windows installation or Linux installation alone, and then purchase the biggest hard disk drive you can afford alongside it. For example, get a 64 gig SSD and then a 500 gig hard drive. In my opinion, I'd opt for the biggest SSD that I could afford. I got the 240 gig one on this budget, and then later on you can add a hard disk drive should you run out of space. You know, I keep the Windows installation on here as well as a few games because it just makes things run a bit faster and a bit smoother. But of course what you do in terms of storage is entirely up to you. I nearly forgot the power supply. This is a Silverstone PSU. I bought it second hand on eBay for about £20. Never skimp on a PSU, it's the most important part of any system, and if you buy a cheap one it goes boom. Chances are you could take every other component with it. This is a slightly older one now. It seems to be a pretty decent unit, and at 500 watts it's more than enough to power our i5 here and our GTX 960. The thing about the i5 as well, before we get into the games, is that you can upgrade it to say an i7 later down the line because of the support that this motherboard provides. All in all, it's a pretty cheap system. It's not the best looking PC in the world, but it should give you pretty decent frame rates when it comes to those esports titles, and can even handle a few AAA games as well. And with all that said, let's get into the benchmarks to see what this thing can do. Okay, let me just quickly address what could be an elephant in the room, and that is old Dell Optiplexes. I could have bought an old i5 pre-built Dell unit, upgraded the PSU, the SSD and added a graphics card, but by the time I'd done that it would have cost more, or if not a very similar price, to building a PC from scratch. Of course though, it's all about saving you money, so if where you live doing that, buying an Optiplex and upgrading it is the cheaper road to go down, then by all means do it. So in Csgo here we've got the high settings in the game. The game auto selected these settings and we're running well above 60 frames per second. In fact, we're running above 100 frames per second most of the time at 1080p. There may be a few instances where the frame rate drops here and there, but overall it's a very smooth experience and you'll have no trouble playing esports titles like Counter-Strike Global Offensive. As we move on to Fortnight, what struck me as quite odd and surprising here was that Fortnight actually maxes out the i5 2320 at 100% usage a lot of the time. This doesn't seem to have a significantly adverse effect on frame rate, but it's just something to bear in mind. In 2019 now, 4-core, 4-threaded processors can struggle in some titles. I didn't expect it to do so here, but the game is still more than playable and you will still see a higher than 60 frames per second average. It's always worth considering all your options. If you plan to upgrade later on, is it just worth buying something a little bit newer to begin with? You know, there are plenty of things to consider, but if you've got a budget of around £150 to £200 here in the UK, or the same in dollars, then personally, I'd recommend shopping around on that 1155 platform because there are certainly some brilliant bargains to be had. PUBG surprised me as well. With a mixture of low and medium settings, we were able to hit 60 frames per second on average. There will be a few instances where that frame rate dips, but all in all, it was a pretty decent experience. Just bear in mind that newer AAA titles may struggle a little bit. I'm not going to lie to you, Metro Exodus probably isn't going to be a game that you'll be able to play on this PC. Okay, I don't know why I threw San Andreas in here, but you'll be surprised to see that even when you turn the settings right up, it can be quite demanding. Look, we're only getting about 70 to 80 frames per second. San Andreas is just one of those timeless games that is always worth a play, and more often than not, I think you'll find yourself installing this on your system, so I threw it in here anyway. It's a fantastic classic, probably the greatest game of all time, or one of them, so yeah, I just thought you might want to see how it runs. Okay, let's try a couple of AAA titles to finalise here. Fallout 4 has a 60 frames per second cap on it, and you'll have no problem in hitting that most of the time with this system. And the high settings, Fallout 4 actually runs very nicely. This is the Steam version of the game. I didn't uncap it because it can cause some graphical glitches, but 60 FPS at 1080p runs just perfectly on the i5 2320, and GTX 960. As you move into busier areas of the wasteland or places with more clutter, you may see that frame rate drop to the high 40s. Because of that, you might want to turn the settings down to medium, but I think it's a pretty good result here. Finally, I tried Battlefield 5. This ran quite well as well. 1080p with the low settings here will get you a reasonably playable FPS. So it's nice to see that even new titles like this one can run on this system. But to conclude, I think it is certainly best suited to those esports games. If you want to put together something that's relatively cheap, you just want to play Fortnight, Csgo, things like that, then this is a PC that will make you quite happy. And with all that said, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, leave a like on it. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And hopefully, I'll see you all in the next one.